November 16, 1944. The air over the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Italian Alps was a brittle, freezing blue. At 25,000 feet, the temperature inside the unheated aluminum cockpit of an American fighter plummeted well below zero. For the pilots of the United States 15th Air Force, the biting cold was just one of the many silent killers in a combat theater that the press back home routinely forgot about. The newspapers loved writing about the glamour of the 8th Air Force flying out of England, but the men of the 15th, flying out of the muddy tent city airfields of southern Italy, fought a grinding, merciless war of attrition over the Alps, the Mediterranean, and the heavily defended oil refineries of the Third Reich. Captain John C. Voll was 22 years old, and he did not care about newspaper coverage. He was from Goshen, Ohio, a Midwestern town small enough that hard work wasn't considered a virtue. It was simply the default setting of human existence. In the 308th Fighter Squadron of the 31st Fighter Group, Voll was known for a quiet, almost unnerving level of focus. He wasn't a natural-born stunt pilot, and he didn't fly with the reckless cinematic abandon of the barnstormers who sought glory in the clouds. Voll approached aerial combat like a master carpenter approaching a complex blueprint. He understood angles, he understood energy retention, and he understood that surviving a dogfight had less to do with courage and everything to do with geometry. The tool he used to execute this geometry was the North American P-51D Mustang. By late 1944, the Mustang was already a legend, but few pilots understood its physical properties as intimately as Voll. The secret to the P-51 wasn't just its supercharged Packard V1650 Merlin engine, it was the wing. The Mustang utilized a revolutionary laminar flow wing design. By moving the thickest part of the wing further aft, engineers drastically reduced the aerodynamic drag of the boundary layer, allowing the aircraft to slice through the air with far less resistance than a German Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf. Furthermore, the massive belly scoop radiator wasn't just for cooling liquid. It utilized something called the Meredith effect, where the heated exhaust air rushing out of the radiator actually generated a small amount of forward jet thrust. The P-51 wasn't just a fighter, it was a thermodynamic and aerodynamic miracle, and John C. Voll had already used it to shoot down 16 enemy aircraft, making him one of the deadliest hunters in the Mediterranean. Before we follow Captain Voll down into an impossible solitary survival fight that defies all tactical logic, if you believe the true, unfiltered mechanics of the Second World War deserve to be preserved, please hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that real tactical military history matters more than Hollywood myths. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this engagement, and I want to ask you, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We read every single comment, and we want to honor their legacy. Now, let's go back to the freezing skies over Italy. On this specific morning, Voll's legendary Mustang, painted with the name American Beauty, was failing him. He was leading a massive flight of Mustangs to escort heavy bombers into Munich, Germany. But as they crossed the Alps, a severe electrical malfunction plagued his aircraft. His radios flooded with thick static, and his vital flight instruments began glitching. Deep in enemy territory, flying a high-performance fighter with failing electrical systems is a death sentence. Voll made the frustrating but mathematically correct decision. He aborted the primary mission. He handed over command of the flight and banked his lone Mustang south, beginning the long, isolated trek back to base in San Severo, Italy. He was entirely alone. As he crossed back over the Alps and descended into the airspace near Udine, Italy, Voll's eyes scanned the sprawling patchwork of the terrain below. The Udine area was teeming with heavily fortified German air bases. Flying solo over it was an absolute invitation to disaster. But at 10,000 feet, Voll spotted a shadow moving against the earth. It was a solitary German Junkers U-88, a versatile twin-engine bomber. It was flying low, cruising over the Italian countryside, seemingly completely unaware that a lone American predator was lurking miles above it in the freezing air. Standard tactical doctrine dictated that a solitary fighter pilot with an ailing aircraft should ignore the bait, maintain his altitude, and use his speed to run for home. Diving on the bomber meant sacrificing the 10,000 feet of potential energy he had stored in the altitude bank. If he dove and there were enemy fighters nearby, he would be caught low, slow, and horribly outnumbered. Voll weighed the arithmetic. He meticulously checked the sky around him. It appeared empty. The temptation was simply too great. He pushed the heavy control stick forward. The Packard Merlin engine roared as gravity grabbed the Mustang, accelerating the heavy fighter into a screaming 400-mile-per-hour dive toward the unsuspecting bomber. Voll lined up the twin-engine U-88 in his K-14 gyroscopic gun sight, calculating the deflection angle with the cold precision of an Ohio tradesman. He closed the distance in seconds, ready to unleash his 6.50 caliber machine guns. But as Voll committed to the attack, pulling within firing range of the bomber, a chilling realization washed over him. The sky above him was no longer empty. Dropping out of the blinding glare of the morning sun, closing the trap with terrifying speed, was a massive formation of German fighters. Focke-Wulf TW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Voll did a rapid, hard-stopping count. There were exactly 12 of them, 7 FW-190s and 5 Bf-109s. They had altitude, they had the element of surprise, and they had him boxed in perfectly against the Italian terrain. Captain John C. Voll had just traded all of his altitude for a single bomber, and now the bill was due. The most violent 5 minutes of his life had just begun. In the lethal three-dimensional chessboard of aerial combat, altitude is life. When you trade your altitude to dive on a target, you are spending your life savings on a single transaction. When Captain John C. Voll pushed the nose of his P-51D Mustang down to intercept the lone Junkers Ju-88 bomber over Udine, he spent his 10,000 feet of altitude. As he closed in on the bomber, the sudden appearance of 12 German fighters dropping out of the sun meant his bank account was entirely empty, and the collectors had arrived. The trap had been flawlessly executed. The Ju-88 wasn't just a stray aircraft, it was bait. The enemy fighters had been waiting high above the clouds for an American pilot greedy enough to drop to the deck. Now, Voll was flying at treetop level, pushing 400 miles per hour. Above him, a swarm of 12 elite fighters was plummeting toward his unprotected tail. Every survival instinct, every manual printed by the United States Air Forces screamed at him to break off the attack immediately. If he holed back on the control stick and broke violently to the left or right, he might throw off the diving fighter's aim just long enough to use the Mustang's superior straight-line speed to run for the Adriatic Sea. But Voll was an Ohio pragmatist. He understood the geometry of the trap better than the men who set it. If he broke his dive now, he would expose the massive flat surface area of his Mustang's wings to a dozen diving cannons. He would be a clay pigeon. Furthermore, if he ran, the Ju-88's rear gunner would have a free shot at his tail as he passed. He was dead if he turned, he was dead if he ran. So Voll made a decision that bordered on absolute madness. He ignored the 12 fighters diving on his spine, kept his nose perfectly level, and flew straight at the bomber. He was going to finish the transaction. Voll kept his eyes glued to the K-14 gyroscopic gun sight. The K-14 was a technological marvel, an analog computer that automatically calculated the necessary deflection angle based on the target's wingspan and range. As the twin-engine Ju-88 filled the glowing orange reticle, Voll squeezed the trigger. The 6.5 caliber Browning M2 machine guns roared, dumping over 70 armor-piercing incendiary rounds per second into the bomber. At that proximity, the Mustang didn't just damage the junkers, it chewed it into flaming confetti. The heavy rounds sawed through the bomber's right wing root and ignited the fuel tanks. The Ju-88 erupted into a massive fireball, violently pitching sideways and slamming into the Italian dirt below. One kill, but Voll had no time to watch it burn. The instant the bomber disintegrated, the sky around the Mustang exploded. Tracers from the diving Bf-109s and FW-190s snapped past his canopy in glowing red streaks. The water in his radiator boiled as the Merlin engine screamed at maximum manifold pressure. Voll slammed the control stick hard over, pulling the Mustang into a brutal, gut-wrenching turn. The G-forces hit him like a concrete slab, instantly multiplying his body weight by 6. The blood rushed from his brain, pooling in his legs, pulling a gray curtain over the edges of his vision. He was now in a low-altitude turning fight, a Kurvenkampf against 12 highly maneuverable enemy aircraft. Some legends and exaggerated retellings claim this dogfight lasted 22 minutes. But the official Air Force records reveal something much more terrifying. This entire engagement, from the moment the Ju-88 exploded to the final gunshot, lasted exactly 5 minutes. 5 minutes of maximum G, hyper-compressed violence that pushed the human body and the aluminum airframe to the absolute point of molecular failure. This is where the unique physics of the P-51D Mustang kept Voll alive. The German Focke-Wulf FW-190, known as the Butcher Bird, had an astonishing roll rate. It could flip onto its back and change direction faster than the Mustang. If Voll tried to match their rapid reversals, they would effortlessly slide onto his tail and kill him. But Voll knew the Mustang's secret weapon: energy retention. Thanks to the ultra-smooth laminar flow wing, the P-51D bled off significantly less speed in a sustained, tight turn than the German fighters. Voll didn't try to reverse his turns, he just kept pulling. He locked the Mustang into a continuous, agonizingly tight horizontal circle, trusting the aerodynamics of his wing to out-sustain the enemy. The 12-axis fighters swarmed him like angry hornets, but because they were constantly trying to adjust their angles to get a shot, they were bleeding off their airspeed. The geometric circle tightened. The dogfight became a swirling, chaotic vortex of roaring engines and snapping machine gun fire just a few hundred feet above the Italian farm fields. Then, an FW-190 pilot made a fatal geometric error. Frustrated by his inability to land a shot on the circling American, the German pilot pulled too hard on his stick, trying to force his nose around. His heavy fighter shuddered and scrubbed off a massive chunk of airspeed, causing him to momentarily drift wide. In a fraction of a second, Voll snapped the Mustang's nose up, capitalizing on the Mustang's superior energy state. He slid perfectly into the FW-190's blind spot. Voll didn't hesitate. He clamped down on the trigger. A devastating 2-second burst of .50 caliber fire tore through the Butcher Bird's cockpit and engine cowling. The FW-190 violently snapped inverted, trailing a thick plume of black smoke, and plummeted into the ground. 2 kills. But Voll was drowning in adrenaline, and the physical toll was becoming unbearable. His arms were screaming with lactic acid, his breathing was ragged, and 10 furious fighters were still perfectly positioned around him, completely blocking his path home. The swarm was tightening. The true nightmare of the ambush was only just reaching its climax. In the sanitized reports written by intelligence officers after the war, aerial combat is often reduced to clinical statistics: altitude, airspeed, deflection angles, and ammunition expended. But what the reports cannot quantify is the biological toll of a multi-bogey dogfight. Human anatomy is not engineered to withstand sustained high-G centrifugal forces. In the swirling chaos over Udine, Captain John C. Voll's body was being crushed. The lactic acid in his arms burned like battery fluid from physically wrestling the P-51D Mustang's control stick against the immense aerodynamic pressure. His breathing was desperate, sucking pure oxygen from his mask in rapid gasps. The continuous G-forces constantly threatened to drag the blood out of his brain, narrowing his peripheral vision into a dark, pulsing tunnel. He had already destroyed the Junkers J-88 bomber and one FW-190 fighter, but the sky was still swarming. 10 German fighters remained, circling above and around him, taking turns diving in for the kill. Voll knew he couldn't stay in a defensive circle forever. The Packard V1650 Merlin engine in front of him was an engineering marvel, but it was being pushed well beyond its thermal limits. The Mustang's massive belly radiator was working overtime, scooping in freezing air to keep the liquid-cooled engine from melting itself into a block of useless slag. He was burning fuel at an atrocious rate. If he didn't change the geometry of the fight, he was going to die, not from an enemy bullet, but from a dry fuel tank over hostile territory. He needed an exit vector, but he had to buy it with violence. The German pilots were becoming frustrated. They had a massive numerical advantage, yet the lone American was slipping through their firing solutions like water. Frustration breeds impatience, and in aerial combat, impatience is fatal. A German pilot in a Messerschmitt Bf-109 decided to break the stalemate. Instead of maintaining his energy advantage above the fight, he chopped his throttle and dove directly into Voll's turning circle, trying to force a high-deflection snapshot. It was a gross miscalculation of the Mustang's capabilities. Voll saw the gray and green mottled camouflage of the Bf-109 dropping into his turn. Instead of breaking away, Voll stomped on his rudder pedals and hauled the heavy control stick straight back, tightening his turn radius to the absolute aerodynamic limit. The Mustang groaned, the rivets popping and protesting, but the laminar flow wings gripped the air perfectly. Voll pulled his nose inside the diving Messerschmitt's flight path. He didn't even look through the glowing reticle of his K-14 gun sight. He flew by the pure, instinctual feel of the machine. He squeezed the trigger. A devastating burst of .50 caliber fire tore upward, intersecting perfectly with the Bf-109's belly. The heavy armor-piercing rounds shattered the Messerschmitt's engine block and severed its fuel lines. The Bf-109 erupted in a flash of white-hot fire, flipping wildly out of control before plunging into the Italian countryside.
3 kills. But Voll was entirely out of airspeed. He was hanging in the sky, slow and vulnerable, a sitting duck for the remaining fighters. Seeing the Americans stall out, another German pilot, this time in a Focke-Wulf FW-190, rolled inverted and dove for the execution shot. Voll didn't panic. He shoved his throttle past the detent into war emergency power, dumped his nose, and initiated a maneuver known as the rolling scissors. The rolling scissors is a desperate, weaving flight path where 2 aircraft continuously roll across each other's flight paths, each trying to force the other to fly out in front. It is a game of aerodynamic chicken. Because the FW-190 was diving from altitude, it carried significantly more speed than Voll's Mustang. Voll used that speed against him. He chopped his own throttle, popped his flaps, and executed a violent barrel roll, intentionally scrubbing off his remaining airspeed. The German pilot, carrying too much momentum to slow down, blew right past Voll's canopy, overshooting the American entirely. The roles were instantly reversed. For a fraction of a second, the FW-190 was framed perfectly in the center of Voll's windscreen. Voll pulled the trigger. His .50 caliber ammunition hammered into the Focke-Wulf's fuselage, ripping through the cockpit and shattering the canopy. The FW-190 snapped into a violent, uncontrolled spin, plummeting toward the earth to become the 4th casualty of the morning. Seconds later, Voll caught one more enemy fighter in his sights, pouring a lethal burst into its airframe and sending it smoking toward the ground to seal his 5th kill of the mission. 5 kills in exactly 5 minutes.
He had just achieved the legendary status of ace in a day in a single solitary dogfight against impossible odds. The remaining Axis fighters had seen enough. They had lost 5 aircraft to a single isolated Mustang, and their morale was completely broken. They broke off the pursuit, pulling up and turning back toward their airfields, leaving the battered American fighter alone in the sky. Voll didn't celebrate. He leveled out, his hands trembling violently on the controls, and pointed the nose of American Beauty south toward the Adriatic Sea. When Captain John C. Voll finally landed at his base in San Severo, Italy, his flight suit was drenched in sweat, his muscles cramping so severely he could barely stand. When the armorers checked his wing guns, they found them empty. He had fought a 12-to-1 ambush down to his very last bullet. For his impossible survival on November 16, 1944, Voll was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. By the time the conflict ended, the quiet carpenter from Ohio had accumulated 21 confirmed aerial victories, making him the undisputed top-scoring ace of the 15th Air Force and the Mediterranean theater. He never wrote a flashy memoir. He never sought the Hollywood spotlight. He simply returned home, understanding that the sky is a mathematical equation, and on that freezing November morning, he was the only man who knew the correct answer.
If this story reminded you that the greatest battles of the Second World War weren't fought by supermen, but by ordinary kids who refused to quit when the math was against them, please hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it keeps these forgotten archives alive for the people who deserve to hear them. Subscribe if you haven't already. We don't cover the sanitized history here. We go into the cockpit, into the exhaustion, and into the absolute truth of the air war. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We read every single one, and these names belong in the conversation, not fading away in an archive box. John C. Voll trusted the geometry, and he didn't run from the swarm. Don't quit on this channel. We'll see you in the next one.